A police officer, fueled by racial prejudice, stopped a successful black businesswoman, Rosemary Carter, accusing her of driving a stolen car. Within moments, the situation shifted dramatically in a way no one could have predicted, and what began as an act of injustice sparked a movement that would challenge the entire system. Rosemary was driving through the peaceful suburban streets of Queen City with her 10-year-old niece, Queen, by her side. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the trees, casting soft shadows along the road. Queen, excited about her art class, eagerly asked her aunt if her painting would be featured in an exhibition. Rosemary, smiling, reassured her, "With your talent, no one could say no." The calm drive soon came to a halt when blue and red lights flashed in the rearview mirror, followed by the shrill sound of a siren. Rosemary glanced in the mirror to see a police cruiser tailing them, its lights flashing urgently. "What's happening, Aunt Rosemary?" Queen asked, gripping her backpack in fear. "It's okay, sweetheart," Rosemary replied, trying to keep her voice calm as she pulled over to the side of the road. "We just need to stay calm." As Rosemary switched off the engine and placed her hands on the steering wheel, she kept her composure, remembering what she had taught Queen about handling police stops safely. In the mirror, she saw a large officer step out of his patrol car, his uniform neat, but his expression filled with prejudice. His hand hovered near his gun as he approached the car. Rosemary rolled down the window, feeling the tension in the air. "License and registration," Officer Joe Walker demanded curtly, his eyes fixed on Rosemary. Rosemary met his gaze steadily, her voice calm yet firm. "Officer, may I ask why I'm being stopped?" Joe took a deep breath, his irritation barely concealed. "I said license and registration." "Officer, I'm happy to comply, but I need to understand why I'm being stopped." "I haven't violated any traffic laws," Rosemary responded. Joe's gaze shifted from the shiny Mercedes to Rosemary's composed face, his frown deepening. "You made a left turn without signaling," he claimed, his tone turning harsher. Rosemary, not backing down, calmly tilted her head. "I'm sure I used my signal. If necessary, you can review the traffic cameras." Her response momentarily caught Joe off guard, but he quickly slammed his hand on the roof of the car, startling Queen. "Step out of the car." "I'm not here to argue with you," he barked. Rosemary remained seated, hands steady on the wheel. "I refuse to leave the car unless you provide a valid reason. There's a child in the car, and I have the right to ensure our safety." Her calm defiance fueled Joe's frustration, and soon, a few curious neighbors came outside to witness the growing confrontation, some recording the scene with their phones. Joe, realizing the attention he had drawn, glanced nervously around, his eyes landing on a middle-aged man filming the exchange. As a neighbor held up a phone, recording the encounter, Joe's face tightened with tension. He clenched his teeth and growled, "You're making this harder on yourself." Rosemary took a deep breath, her voice steady and resolute. "No, officer. I'm simply protecting my legal rights. I've done nothing wrong, and I won't let anyone intimidate me or my niece." Queen, sitting beside her, bit her lip, her small hands trembling as she watched her aunt stand firm. A neighbor called out, "She has the right to know why she's being stopped." Another added, "We're filming everything." Joe turned sharply, glaring at the growing group of onlookers. "Don't think your phones can change anything," he barked, his voice cracking slightly. But Rosemary didn't flinch. "Officer, you can follow proper procedure and give a legitimate reason, or I will wait for my attorney. I'm not obstructing your work, but I won't accept unfair treatment." The neighborhood fell into a tense silence as phones continued recording, every eye on Joe. He stood frozen, his hand hovering near his gun, unsure of his next move. The injustice was evident, and everyone was watching to see how Joe would respond. After what felt like an eternity, he muttered under his breath and stormed back to his patrol car without another word. Rosemary remained calm, but as Joe disappeared from view, she turned to Queen and gently took her hand. "It's okay now, sweetheart," she said soothingly, even though her heart raced. Hours later, a video capturing the entire incident surfaced on social media, quickly going viral. The video garnered millions of views within a single night. Rosemary's calm stance against Joe's abuse of power sparked public outrage, and the hashtag Justice for Rosemary erupted with thousands of comments demanding Joe Walker's suspension and accountability. One Twitter user wrote, "This is a textbook example of police abuse and systemic bias," while another praised her, "She's so calm and brave, inspiring." In response, the Queen City Police Department issued a statement announcing that Joe had been temporarily suspended pending an investigation. However, the situation didn't end there. Rosemary quickly became the focal point of media attention, with reporters gathered outside her home and office, eager to secure an interview. The questions came relentlessly, not just about the incident, but about her personal life as well. "Miss Carter, how did it feel to face an officer abusing their power? Do you think your response was the right one?" one reporter asked. Rosemary maintained her professional demeanor, responding briefly, "I believe everyone has the right to be treated fairly, and that's what I'm standing up for." But not everyone supported her. Some conservative media outlets began attacking Rosemary, accusing her of exaggerating the incident to gain attention. Articles with sensational headlines like "Woman Blows Minor Incident Out of Proportion" and "Entrepreneur Exploits Traffic Stop for Publicity" spread across the news. These baseless accusations sparked a wave of mixed reactions. While some questioned Rosemary's motives, her supporters grew even more resolute in defending her. At the same time, Rosemary started receiving anonymous messages on her phone. What began as insulting remarks soon escalated into sinister threats. "You don't belong in our neighborhood. Stay silent, or you'll regret it." One evening, while Rosemary was sitting in the living room with Queen, her phone buzzed once again. Rosemary sat frozen, staring at the chilling message on her phone. "We know where you live. Don't let this go any further." A shiver ran down her spine as she quietly deleted the text, not wanting Queen to sense her fear. But deep inside, she knew she couldn't let the threat slide. She turned to her lawyer, Michael Green, to discuss what to do next. "I won't let these messages intimidate me," Rosemary said firmly. "If I stay silent, they'll think they can threaten anyone." Michael nodded, his expression serious. "We need to report this to the police, but be prepared. This won't just be a legal battle. It'll also be a public one." The following morning, Rosemary received an article titled "Rosemary Carter, Hero or Opportunist?" The piece insinuated that she was using the incident to draw attention to her business. Rosemary read it calmly, but a fierce determination burned in her eyes. If they thought they could stop her, they were mistaken. Public support for Rosemary continued to grow as civil rights organizations rallied behind her, calling for a full, transparent investigation not only into Joe Walker, but also into the Queen City Police Department. Michael asked if Rosemary wanted to do a TV interview when the invitation came in. "Yes," Rosemary replied, her voice steady. "I'm not speaking just for myself. I'm speaking for everyone who's been treated unjustly." The attention was overwhelming, but Rosemary understood it was just the beginning of a much larger fight. She stood by the window in Michael's office, sunlight streaming across her face. Concern was etched in her expression. She knew this went beyond one officer's abuse of power. "I have a feeling this isn't just about Joe Walker's actions," she said, eyes fixed on the passing cars below. "This seems like something that's been carefully protected, covered up. There's someone behind the system." Michael, seated at his desk surrounded by files, flipped through a document and nodded. "I think so too, but to uncover the truth, we'll need more concrete evidence." Later that afternoon, Michael received an anonymous call. A deep, cautious voice spoke on the other end. "I have the information Miss Carter needs, but this isn't safe to discuss over the phone." "Who are you?" Michael asked, keeping his voice steady. "Just know I was part of the system. If you want the truth, meet me at this address tonight." The man recited an address in an abandoned industrial area on the outskirts of town and hung up. Michael turned to Rosemary. "We've got a lead, but it's risky. If this is a trap—" "We can't back down," Rosemary interrupted, her eyes resolute. "We have to go." That night, they drove to the outskirts, where abandoned warehouses stood shrouded in eerie silence. They parked outside a rusted warehouse with a broken sign. Michael glanced at Rosemary. Are you sure about this? Absolutely, Rosemary replied, taking a deep breath. They stepped inside, the beam of a small flashlight cutting through the dust-covered shelves. The stillness was so profound they could hear their footsteps echoing. In the corner, they found a locked filing cabinet. Michael pried it open with a metal bar, revealing stacks of old documents stamped "Confidential." Rosemary opened one folder and skimmed its pages. Her eyes widened in realization. This is a list of dismissed lawsuits and complaints ignored by the system. All of them bear the signature of one man, Charles Walker. Michael clenched his jaw as he quickly flipped through more files. Charles Walker isn't just a retired judge. He's the one orchestrating the cover-up of all these abuses. This is evidence of a system that's been corrupted from within for decades. As they reviewed the documents, the glare of headlights suddenly pierced through the warehouse's windows. The roar of engines shattered the silence. "We've got company," Michael whispered, quickly stuffing the critical documents into a bag. 4 men entered, their menacing figures illuminated by large flashlights. The leader of the group spoke in a voice dripping with menace. "Ms. Carter, Attorney Green, you shouldn't be here." Rosemary didn't flinch. "We have every right to seek the truth. If you think you can stop us, go ahead and try." The man laughed coldly. "The truth doesn't matter as much as your lives. Hand over the documents, and maybe we'll let you walk out of here." Michael stepped forward, shielding Rosemary. "That's not going to happen." One of the men lunged toward them, but Rosemary quickly raised her phone and turned on the camera. "Anything you do will be recorded and sent to the press immediately." The group hesitated, their eyes darting nervously to the phone. After a tense moment, the leader motioned for a retreat. "Let's go." But this isn't over. The men withdrew, leaving Rosemary and Michael standing in the dusty warehouse. Back at the office, the two exhaled deeply but couldn't shake the tension. "We now have everything we need to prove Charles Walker is behind this," Michael said, organizing the documents. "But Rosemary, this is only the beginning. They won't sit idly by while we expose them." Rosemary nodded. "If they want to stop us, I'll show them the power of justice. We won't back down." In her hands, the aged documents weren't just evidence. They were a beacon of hope. This was the start of a fight against a deeply corrupt system. She never thought she would face this, but she was ready. Later, as Rosemary sat in her home office, the glow of the desk lamp illuminated her face. The files lay in front of her, but her mind wandered beyond the evidence. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was a chance to transform a broken system. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "Aunt Rosemary's?" Queen stood in the doorway, holding a stack of papers and a watercolor set. Her eyes shone with a mixture of worry and determination. "Are you okay?" Rosemary smiled, though Queen could see the weariness in her eyes. "I'm okay, sweetheart. But this is going to be harder than I imagined." Queen stepped in and sat across from her. "I know you're doing something important, not just for you, but for everyone else. I want to help too." Rosemary raised an eyebrow, surprised by the maturity in Queen's words. "You've already helped me so much, just by staying safe." Queen shook her head. "No, I made this." She pulled out a drawing. "I think people need to see that no matter what happens, we should never give up." Rosemary took the picture. Queen had drawn a vibrant image of a woman standing tall in the midst of a storm, holding a blazing torch, surrounded by raised hands. The words "Justice for All" were written at the top in Queen's unsteady but heartfelt handwriting. Rosemary was silent for a moment, her throat tightening with emotion. She gently ran her hand over Queen's hair. "This is beautiful, Queen. It says everything I want to fight for." "Thank you." Queen's drawing became a symbol of courage and unity. The next day, Rosemary and Michael met with social activists, local pastors, and community leaders at a small cultural center. The room was filled with determination. "We can't let this be just a personal story," Rosemary said. "It's time for us to unite and build a movement, not just for justice for me, but for everyone who's been crushed by this system." Michael nodded. "We have evidence against Charles Walker and his network, but that's not enough. We need community support. We need everyone's voice to push for real change. An elderly pastor, Mr. Davis, spoke up. I've seen many battles like this, but this time I feel a difference. Rosemary, you've sparked hope in people's hearts. A young activist, Clara, picked up Queen's drawing. I think this is the symbol we need, she said. A picture that represents strength, courage, and unity. The room agreed, and Queen's drawing became the emblem of the movement. The name Justice for All was adopted, and plans for a large march to capture media attention and demand systemic reform were set. That evening, Rosemary returned home feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. Queen was reading a book on the couch, but immediately looked up when Rosemary entered. "What do you think of my drawing?" she asked. Rosemary sat beside her niece, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You haven't just helped me, Queen. You've helped the entire movement. Your drawing has become a symbol for all of us." Queen beamed, but then grew serious. "Aunt Rosemary, I'm scared. What if the bad people try to hurt you?" Rosemary took a deep breath and pulled Queen close. "You know, being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means moving forward even when you're afraid. I'm not just doing this for me. I'm doing it for you, for everyone who doesn't have a voice." Queen nodded, her eyes steady and mature beyond her years. "Then I won't be scared anymore. I'll stand with you." In the days that followed, Queen's drawing appeared across social media, on posters and t-shirts worn by those supporting the movement. Enthusiasm spread throughout the communities, and the first March of the Justice for All movement took place on a sunny afternoon, drawing thousands. A racist police officer stops a black female millionaire, suspecting her car is stolen. However, in just 10 minutes, the balance of power shifts dramatically, taking the situation in an unexpected direction. How did one act of injustice spark a movement that would shake the entire system? Let's explore this dramatic story. The silver Mercedes glided smoothly down the quiet streets of Queen City, a suburban neighborhood with lush trees lining the road. Rosemary Carter, a successful businesswoman, sat behind the wheel, her 10-year-old niece Queen beside her. Queen eagerly asked if her painting would make it into the exhibition, and Rosemary reassured her with a smile. The peaceful drive was interrupted by flashing police lights and a siren. "What's happening, Aunt Rosemary?" the Queen asked nervously as Rosemary calmly pulled over. A large officer, his face full of prejudice, approached the car. He demanded Rosemary's license and registration. She responded calmly, asking why she was being stopped, asserting she hadn't broken any laws. The officer fabricated a reason, claiming she had turned without signaling. Rosemary remained firm, offering to review traffic camera footage if needed. The officer, frustrated by her calm demeanor, demanded she step out of the car, but Rosemary refused, insisting on understanding the reason for the stop and ensuring her and her niece's safety. Neighbors began to gather and film the interaction. The officer, noticing the growing crowd, reluctantly retreated, and the situation ended without further conflict. Later, a video of the incident went viral, drawing widespread outrage. People rallied behind Rosemary, demanding accountability for the officer. Despite some media attacks calling Rosemary's actions exaggerated, public support for her grew. Threats soon began to flood her inbox, but Rosemary refused to be intimidated, knowing she had to continue speaking out. The next day, civil rights groups rallied for a transparent investigation, not only into the officer, but into the entire police department. Rosemary agreed to give a TV interview, determined to speak for those who had been unjustly treated. As public attention intensified, Rosemary felt this battle was bigger than a single officer. It was about exposing a system that had been protecting corruption for years. That evening, Rosemary and her lawyer, Michael Green, followed a lead from an anonymous source. They met in a dark, abandoned warehouse, where they uncovered documents revealing a systemic cover-up of abuses, all linked to a man named Charles Walker. The two realized the scope of the corruption, knowing this was just the beginning. As they reviewed the evidence, they were confronted by a group of men who threatened them into handing over the documents. Rosemary stood her ground, recording the incident with her phone, which led the men to retreat. Back at the office, Rosemary and Michael knew they had what they needed to expose Walker, but the fight was far from over. Later at home, Rosemary's niece Queen brought in a drawing she had made, a woman standing tall in the storm, holding a torch with the words, "Justice for all," written above it. Rosemary was moved by the drawing, seeing it as a powerful symbol of the movement. The next day, they met with activists, pastors, and community leaders who agreed to adopt the drawing as the symbol of their cause. Rosemary's fight for justice was now larger than just her own battle. It was a movement for systemic change. Despite her fear, she found strength in Queen's courage and determination. As the movement grew, Queen's drawing appeared everywhere, sparking excitement and support across the city. The first march, which took place on a sunny afternoon, drew thousands, all united in their demand for justice. This was just the beginning of a fight that would change the system forever. The city center was alive with energy as thousands gathered for the first Justice for All march. People carried banners, and recreations of Queen's artwork were displayed on posters and flags. At the front of the crowd, Rosemary held a flag with the words "Justice for All" emblazoned across it. Her voice rang out through a megaphone, firm and clear. "This isn't just my story," she declared, her words echoing across the square. "This is our story. It's time for change, not just for today, but for future generations." Beside her stood Queen, proudly holding up a large version of her drawing, her face beaming with pride. The sight of the little girl standing beside her aunt captured hearts and quickly became a media sensation, symbolizing the fight for justice and equality. Rosemary knew that from this moment on, her battle was no longer hers alone. It had become a movement powered by hope, courage, and unwavering determination. As the Justice for All movement gained momentum, Queen's painting continued to inspire unity and strength. Meanwhile, Joe Walker found himself grappling with an intense internal struggle. Alone in his dimly lit kitchen, he sat at the table, the overhead light casting long shadows across his face. He wrestled with guilt and regret as the events of the past few weeks haunted him relentlessly. Every night, Joe was plagued by nightmares. Faces of those he had wrongfully arrested flashed before him. A young man's hopeless eyes. A mother's anguished cries as her son was taken away over baseless accusations. But the worst image was Queen's, the terrified little girl sitting in the car, her wide eyes filled with fear as they locked onto his. He would wake up gasping for air, drenched in sweat, sitting on the edge of his bed, whispering to himself, "What have I done?" The question offered no comfort, only a deeper sense of shame. Joe recalled the words his father, Charles Walker, had often told him, "We do this to maintain power. That's how the world works. If you don't control everything, you'll end up being controlled." Once a source of pride, those words now felt like chains, suffocating him. One evening, as Joe returned home, he immediately noticed something off. Packed suitcases stood by the door. His wife, Rachel, stood in the kitchen, her tear-streaked face turned toward him. "Rachel, what's going on?" he asked, his voice low and hesitant. Rachel looked at him with eyes full of pain and resolve. "Joe, I can't do this anymore," she said. "What you've done, what your family has caused, is destroying us." Joe staggered back, his heart sinking. "I don't want you to leave. We can fix this," he pleaded. But Rachel shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You've chosen your father's side, Joe. But I have to choose our children. I won't let them grow up in a house where their father abused his power and trampled over others." Their children came down the stairs, their faces confused and distant. As Rachel picked up the suitcases, she turned back one last time, her voice a whisper but firm. "When you're ready to face the truth, come find us." The door closed behind them, leaving Joe standing motionless in the empty house. He sank to the floor, the weight of loss pressing down on him. It wasn't just his family he had lost. It felt as though he had lost himself. Days passed and Joe struggled to focus. He stared at a framed family photo on his desk, the smiles of Rachel and the kids haunting him like ghosts. One evening, the flicker of the television caught his attention. Rosemary Carter's face appeared during a live interview. "This isn't just about me," Rosemary said, her voice calm yet resolute. It's about everyone who has suffered under an unjust system. It's time for change. Joe switched off the TV, but her words lingered. He remembered standing in front of her car, meeting her unyielding gaze. It wasn't fear he had seen. It was determination. For the first time in years, Joe felt ashamed. That night, he sat at his desk, flipping through old police reports. Each page reminded him of the lives he had ruined. The decisions he once justified now weighed heavily on his conscience. Finally, he picked up a pen and began to write. Rosemary Carter, I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need to do what's right. There are things you need to know, and I'm the only one who can tell you. If you're willing to listen, I want to help. Joe folded the letter and slipped it into an envelope, his hands trembling. He knew this decision would change his life forever. It might even destroy what little he had left, but it was the only way to begin making amends. The next morning, Joe stood outside the post office, clutching the letter. For a long moment he hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped forward, ready to send the letter that would set everything in motion. Late that night, Joe finally dropped the letter into the mailbox, watching it disappear. He knew the consequences of his actions. It wasn't just betrayal. It was an open challenge to his father, Charles Walker, a man who thrived on control and intimidation. At the same time, Rosemary was unaware of the storm brewing against her. She had just wrapped up a meeting with her justice for all collaborators, strategizing ways to use their gathered evidence to demand a city council hearing. Yet, her progress had pushed Charles to his breaking point. In his opulent study, Charles sat brooding, a half-smoked cigar resting in one hand. The headlines about Rosemary's movement had infiltrated every corner of the media, chipping away at the empire he had carefully crafted over decades. They think they can overthrow me, he muttered darkly. Across from him stood Greg Tanner, his longtime enforcer. Greg nodded, awaiting his orders. I'll take care of it, sir. We'll send her a message she can't ignore. Charles's lips curled into a cruel smirk. Make sure she understands. If she doesn't, escalate it until she does. That night, Rosemary double-checked every lock and the recently installed alarm system before tucking Queen into bed. She kissed her niece's forehead, her heart heavy with worry, but her resolve unwavering. At midnight, a loud crash shattered the stillness of the house. Rosemary bolted upright at the sound of breaking glass. Shadows moved swiftly through the yard before masked intruders stormed in, setting off the blaring alarm. Security lights flooded the scene, momentarily disorienting the intruders, who scattered like startled prey. Rosemary wasted no time. She rushed to Queen's room, whispering urgently, "Queen, wake up. We need to go." Queen, still groggy, allowed Rosemary to lead her out the back door and into the cold night. They didn't stop running until they reached safety, hidden from view. By the time the police arrived, the intruders had fled, leaving shattered glass and fear in their wake. A piece of paper lay on the dining table, its jagged scrawl chilling in its simplicity. "We know where Queen is. Don't test our limits." Rosemary's hands trembled as she clutched the note. Queen tugged on her sleeve, her small voice breaking the silence. "What are they going to do to us, Aunt Rosemary?" Rosemary knelt, wrapping Queen in a fierce embrace. "Nothing. I won't let anything happen to you. I promise." Michael Green arrived soon after, his face taut with concern as he surveyed the scene. "This isn't just a threat anymore, Rosemary. It's a direct warning. Charles Walker won't back down. We need to be even more cautious now." Rosemary handed him the note, her jaw set with determination. "This proves we're getting closer to the truth. I won't let them scare me, Michael. I can't. Not when so much is at stake." Michael sighed, admiring her resilience, but knowing the gravity of the situation. "Rosemary, this fight isn't just yours anymore. You're carrying the hopes of so many. But remember, Queen's safety must come first." Rosemary nodded, her gaze moving to the justice for all painting sitting on her desk. "I know, Michael. But if we don't fight now, we'll leave a broken system for the next generation. I can't let Queen grow up in a world where justice doesn't matter." Through the window, Queen watched the two adults talking, her face a mix of fear and determination. She clutched her watercolor set, the same one she'd used to create the movement's emblem. The painting wasn't just art, it was a beacon of courage in the face of adversity. Meanwhile, across the city, Officer Mia Johnson sat in her patrol car, grappling with her conscience. One of the few honest officers in the force, Mia had turned a blind eye to corruption for years, convincing herself that silence was safer. But Rosemary's movement had changed everything. That afternoon, during her break, Mia sat in a quiet cafe, her laptop open in front of her. Logging into the department's internal system, she began downloading incriminating files, reports, emails, and evidence of cover-ups. Every piece painted a damning picture of corruption deeply rooted within the force. She transferred the files onto a USB drive, her heart pounding as she closed her laptop. She knew what this meant. Once she acted, she could never turn back. That evening, Mia called Rosemary using a burner phone. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice steady but cautious. "Yes, who is this?" Rosemary replied, sensing the urgency in the caller's tone. "This is Officer Mia Johnson. I have critical information about the corruption in the police department. We need to meet in person. It's too dangerous to discuss over the phone." Rosemary paused for a moment, then answered, "I'll do everything I can to protect you. Where should we meet?" Mia gave her the location and hung up, feeling a mix of relief and fear. Back at the station, suspicious glances from her colleagues confirmed her worst fears. One officer she had trusted leaned in as she walked past and whispered, "Mia, take my advice. Stay out of things that don't concern you." Mia didn't reply. She simply walked out of the station, clutching the USB drive tightly in her pocket. She was done staying silent. Home, she noticed an unfamiliar car parked outside her house. Her heart raced as she spotted a note taped to the windshield. "Don't interfere, or your family will pay the price." Shaking, Mia rushed inside. Knowing this wasn't just a warning, it was a clear sign she was being watched. With no other choice, Mia called Rosemary and told her everything. "You need to leave immediately," Rosemary said firmly. "I'll help you find a safe place." With Michael Green's help, Mia and her family were relocated to a safe house provided by the Justice for All movement. There, Rosemary met Mia for the first time. "Thank you for doing this," Rosemary said, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I know it wasn't an easy decision." Mia smiled faintly, but tension remained evident on her face. "You don't need to thank me. I'm just doing what I should have done a long time ago." Mia handed Rosemary the USB drive containing damning evidence against Charles Walker and his co-conspirators in the police force. "This is everything I have," Mia said. "But be careful. They won't stop." The documents provided undeniable proof: forged reports, erased records, and even lists of bribes Charles Walker had orchestrated to protect his corrupt network. Rosemary, Michael, and Mia began planning how to release the information in the safest way possible. Mia knew standing against Charles meant she could lose everything, but she refused to back down. "You can step away at any time," Rosemary told her, placing a reassuring hand on Mia's shoulder. "No," Mia replied, her eyes resolute. "If I don't do this, I'll never be able to look my children in the eye." Back at the safe house, Mia's 8-year-old daughter ran up to her and hugged her tightly. "Mommy, are we going to be okay?" the girl asked, her eyes filled with worry. Mia knelt, smoothing her daughter's hair, and smiled. "We'll be fine, sweetheart. Mommy's doing the right thing." From a distance, Rosemary watched the scene, a sense of hope welling in her chest. She realized that she and Queen were no longer alone in this fight. They now had brave allies willing to risk everything to demand justice. With Mia by her side, Rosemary believed they were closer than ever to bringing down Charles Walker and the corrupt system he had built. But she also knew the challenges ahead would only grow more dangerous. Holding the USB drive that Officer Mia Johnson had given her, Rosemary felt the weight of the responsibility resting on her shoulders. The evidence didn't just implicate Charles Walker. It could topple an entire system deeply rooted in corruption. "This will be the biggest blow we've ever struck," Michael Green said as the team gathered around Rosemary's office table. "But it'll also be the riskiest." Rosemary nodded, her gaze steady. "We have no choice. The people who've suffered deserve to know the truth." 2 days later, in the city's central square, a large stage had been set up. Hundreds of residents, journalists, and human rights advocates gathered, holding signs with slogans like "Justice for Alls" and "Justice Never Backs Down." Rosemary stepped onto the stage, the microphone gleaming under the sunlight. As she looked out at the crowd, behind her, Queen stood clutching a volunteer's hand, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and nervousness. "We are here today," Rosemary began, her voice strong and clear, "to confront the truths that have been hidden for far too long. This isn't just my story. It's the story of hundreds, even thousands, who've suffered under a corrupt system." She raised the USB drive high for the crowd to see. "In my hands is proof of a web of corruption led by Charles Walker that has protected abusers and harmed our community. Today, we're not just exposing this truth, we're demanding justice for every single person this system has failed." Rosemary invited several individuals who had been victims of corruption to share their stories. An elderly man recounted losing his home after challenging an unjust ruling. A young woman spoke about the pain of seeing her brother wrongly imprisoned for years. "I've stayed silent for too long," the elderly man said, his voice trembling but firm. "But thanks to Miss Carter, I now know silence will never bring justice. Today, I speak for all who've been trampled by Charles Walker and his system." The crowd rose to their feet, applauding thunderously. Journalists captured every word and every moment, while Queen watched quietly, her eyes glowing with pride. As the press conference continued, fabricated stories about Rosemary began to surface on conservative media outlets. One article accused her of misusing charity funds, accompanied by doctored images intended to smear her character. Michael received the news during the event. "Rosemary, they're spreading lies about you," he said as she stepped off the stage. Rosemary glanced at the phone screen, reading the false claims. "I guess this is Charles Walker's way of fighting back when he's cornered," she said, her tone calm but her eyes blazing with determination. She returned to the stage, gripping the microphone once more. "I know those who fear the truth will do everything they can to obscure it. I'm not here to defend myself. I'm here to defend those who can't speak for themselves." Rosemary looked directly into the cameras, her voice unwavering. "To those spreading lies, you may try to tarnish my name, but you cannot tarnish the truth." Her words struck a chord with the crowd, earning overwhelming support online. Hashtags like #JusticeForAll and #StandWithRosemary began trending instantly. People who had suffered under Charles Walker's network shared their own stories, putting even more pressure on the corrupt system. Later, Queen handed Rosemary a new painting she had made. It depicted Rosemary standing before a crowd, microphone in hand, with the words, "The truth always wins," boldly written above. Rosemary smiled, realizing that Queen was not just an inspiration, she was the reason Rosemary had to keep fighting. The press conference ended with an outpouring of support, but Rosemary knew it was just the beginning. Charles Walker wouldn't back down without a fight, and his counterattacks would only grow fiercer. "We need to ensure this evidence reaches the right people so the truth can't be buried again," Rosemary told Michael as they walked away from the square. Michael nodded in agreement. "We'll make it happen," he said. Rosemary looked at Queen, skipping along beside her with a carefree smile. Her chest tightened, but her resolve only deepened. For that little girl, Rosemary promised herself, "I'll never stop fighting." As Rosemary's press conference reverberated throughout the city, Charles Walker faced unprecedented pressure. In his dimly lit office, he sat at his desk, eyes fixed on the news broadcast showing Rosemary and the victims recounting their stories. "Joe," Charles said in a low, menacing tone as his son entered the room. Joe stood still for a moment, his eyes meeting his father's piercing stare. "What do you need?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "I need you to do what's right," Charles said, rising and walking toward him. "You need to remember that everything you have, your career, your comfortable life, you owe to me. And now I need you to protect it." Joe took a deep breath, fists clenching. "You call destroying the lives of hundreds of people the right thing? You call threatening Rosemary Carter and an innocent child protecting the family? Charles froze for a moment, eyes flashing with anger. Don't act like you're innocent, Joe. Don't forget the role you've played in all of this. Everything I've done has been to protect you, to protect the Walker name. Joe's voice turned bitter. You're not protecting anything. You're just safeguarding your power, even at the cost of your family. Charles didn't let his composure slip for long. He turned his back to Joe and picked up the phone, issuing a short command. Bring them under control. Joe frowned. What are you doing? Charles turned to face him, his tone cold and unwavering. Rachel and your children. Did you think I wouldn't know Rachel left? Did you think I couldn't find them? Joe's heart stopped. Are you threatening them? Charles smirked.
No, Joe.
I'm reminding you that your family is still safe. But if you go against me, that could change. Joe felt torn in half. On one side, he knew that remaining silent would enable Charles to continue ruling with corruption and fear. On the other, the thought of Rachel and his children paying the price for his decisions was unbearable. You might live with regret for the rest of your life, Charles said, his voice deep and commanding, but you won't be able to bear seeing your family suffer, will you? Joe silently stared at his father, whose face seemed like an unyielding monument of manipulation. But this time, something shifted inside Joe. That night, Joe drove to a secret meeting point Rosemary had arranged. Entering the small room, he found Rosemary and Michael waiting for him. I thought you wouldn't show up, Rosemary said, surprise in her voice. Joe sat down, placing a USB drive on the table. I can't undo what I've done, but I can help you end this. Here's everything I have, documents, recordings, all the evidence against my father and his associates. Rosemary studied him, caution evident in her expression. You understand this won't just cost you your career. It'll put you and your family in danger. Joe nodded, his voice steady but low. I know, but I can't live like this anymore. I need to do what's right, no matter the consequences. Michael picked up the USB, scanning a few files on his laptop.
My God.
This is what we've been waiting for: financial transactions, gag orders, forged documents. This is the killing blow. Rosemary looked at Joe, her expression softening for the first time. Thank you. But are you ready to face your fathers? Joe exhaled deeply, pain evident in his eyes. I'm not just facing him. I'm facing myself. As Joe left the room, he knew his life would never be the same. Charles wouldn't let this go, and there was no turning back. But for the first time in years, Joe felt he was on the right path. Across the city, Charles received a curt phone call from one of his operatives. Sir, Joe has handed over everything to Rosemary Carter. Charles gripped his glass of whiskey tightly, his eyes darkening. Fine, he said, his voice like rolling thunder. If he chooses her side, then he's no son of mine. But this time, Joe was prepared for the fallout. Even if it meant risking everything to atone for his past, he knew it was the right thing to do. News of the evidence Joe and Rosemary provided quickly reached the FBI. A major investigation was launched, targeting Charles Walker and his vast network of corruption. At Charles Walker's mansion, a loud knock echoed through the quiet morning. When he opened the door, a team of FBI agents stood waiting. Charles Walker, you are under arrest for corruption, money laundering, and obstruction of justice, one agent declared, fastening handcuffs around his wrists. Despite the situation, Charles maintained his composure, though his eyes were cold as steel. You'll regret this, he said, but none of the agents flinched. Weeks later, Charles's trial began in federal court. The courtroom was packed with journalists, activists, and individuals who had suffered under his corrupt system. Charles entered, still clad in a perfectly tailored suit, but the tension in his eyes betrayed his unease. In the witness gallery, Rosemary sat upright, her resolute gaze fixed ahead. Joe, weary but determined, waited for his turn to testify. As the prosecution presented their case, Charles sat stoically, his hands clasped tightly. But when he took the stand, he unveiled his strategy. Joe Walker is the one responsible for all the wrongdoing being examined today, Charles said, his voice steady and sharp. I was merely a father trying to guide my son and protect my family's name. The courtroom fell silent at the weight of his accusations. Joe, seated below, clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. Charles continued, his gaze directed squarely at Joe. I tried to protect him, but I couldn't control his reckless actions. Everything you're seeing today is the result of his mistakes. When it was Joe's turn to testify, he stepped up to the stand with a look of resolve. He glanced briefly at Rosemary, who nodded slightly, encouraging him to continue. What my father just said is not only false, it's a blatant distortion of the truth, Joe began, his voice steady and clear. Yes, I was involved in his network. I did things I'm not proud of, but every action I took was under the direction of Charles Walker. He was the mastermind, and every decision originated from him. Joe paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. My father wants to blame me to save himself, but I'm not here to avoid responsibility. I'm ready to face the consequences of my actions, as long as justice is served. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs following Joe's testimony. The prosecution capitalized on the momentum, presenting additional evidence that corroborated his claims, including financial records and recordings of Charles issuing directives. After days of deliberation, the jury found Charles Walker guilty on all counts. As the verdict was read, Charles sat motionless, for the first time unable to project his usual air of smug defiance. Though Joe avoided prison time, due to his cooperation with the prosecution, he knew he had lost his family forever. Rachel didn't bring their children to the trial, and his father now saw him as a traitor. After the trial, Rosemary approached Joe. You did the right thing, she said softly but sincerely. I know that wasn't easy. Joe offered a faint, bittersweet smile. I'm not looking for forgiveness from anyone, but at least now I can live with myself. News of Charles Walker's conviction spread rapidly, symbolizing a triumph in the fight against corruption and abuse of power. The community, especially those who had suffered under Charles's regime, viewed this victory as proof of the strength of resilience and courage. However, Rosemary knew this was just the beginning. The system needed deeper reform to prevent others like Charles from rising again, and she was ready for the road ahead, armed with hope and unwavering determination. After the pivotal trial, Joe Walker stepped out of the courtroom, his shoulders heavy with the weight of what he had done. He had made the right choice, but the cost was steep: his family, his career, and his relationship with his father. Weeks later, Joe sat in Rosemary Carter's office at the community center. Across from him, Queen was engrossed in drawing colorful pictures, images of hope and the future. Rosemary looked at him, her voice calm but resolute. What's next for you, Joe? Everything has changed. This is your chance to start over. Joe nodded slowly, his gaze reflecting newfound determination. I want to make amends, not just for what I've done, but for the people who still believe the system can't be changed. With Rosemary's support, Joe began working at the community center. He participated in workshops on justice and transparency, sharing his story to inspire others. During one such talk, Joe stood before a group of young police officers. I used to think a police officer's strength came from power, from control, Joe shared. But I was wrong. True strength lies in honesty, protecting and serving the community with fairness. Some of the older officers in the group were skeptical, but younger ones, like Rookie Officer Sarah, listened with wide-eyed. Joe's journey to redemption continued as he took on a new challenge. He knew that confronting his former colleagues, those who had been complicit in the corruption, was necessary. So, he arranged to meet Officer David Carter at a small cafe. David, Joe began, his voice steady and sincere. We both know what happened, but it doesn't have to end there. I'm working with Rosemary to build a reform program. You can join us. We can make things right. David scoffed, shaking his head. You think that'll work? This system is bigger than any of us. Maybe it is, Joe replied, his gaze unwavering. But if we don't start somewhere, who will? You once told me you wanted your son to grow up proud of his father. This is your chance to make that happen. After a long silence, David nodded. All right, I'll give it a shot. With David's help, Rosemary's reform program began to grow. Joe led training sessions for police officers, teaching them about transparency, accountability, and how to rebuild trust with the community. In one session, Joe addressed a room full of officers.
We don't just wear a badge, he said.
We represent the values our communities believe in. If we fail, they'll have nothing left to believe in. Gradually, the officers were swayed by Joe's sincerity. Many who had once stayed silent or participated in the corruption began to see things differently. Queen, always by Rosemary and Joe's side, was a symbol of hope at community events. One day, she brought in a new painting, a vibrant image of police officers and community members working together to build a bridge. The words, "Together we build trust," were boldly displayed. Rosemary decided to use Queen's artwork as the symbol for the reform program, emphasizing that change doesn't come from one person but from the collective effort of everyone involved. Every day at the center, Joe felt he was taking another step toward redemption. Though he knew he could never erase his past mistakes, his willingness to face them and work toward making things right became an inspiration to many. Rosemary observed Joe's transformation. One day, she said, "I don't know if I'll ever fully trust you, but I can see that you're trying, and that's worth acknowledging." Joe, filled with gratitude, replied, "I won't stop. Not just for myself, but for everyone who deserves a justice system that truly works." Rosemary's reform movement was no longer just the story of one courageous woman, but of change, hope, and people like Joe Walker, those who had erred but were willing to stand up and start over. A year later, the city basked in clear blue skies, filled with the air of new beginnings. In front of the newly opened community center, hundreds gathered for a special moment, the inauguration of the Queen Carter Community Center, dedicated to supporting youth and families affected by social injustice. Standing on stage, Rosemary's gaze swept over the crowd, people who had stood with her through the difficult journey. The center was named after Queen, not just out of love for her niece, but because Queen had been the inspiration that kept Rosemary fighting. "We've come a long way," Rosemary began, her voice warm but firm. "This center isn't just a building. It's our commitment that no one will face injustice without a place to turn." Queen, now 12 years old, stood beside Rosemary, holding a microphone with slightly trembling hands. Despite her nervousness, her eyes shone with courage. "A year ago, I was scared," Queen began, her voice small but growing stronger. "But Aunt Rosemary taught me that justice isn't just a dream. It's something we all have to work on together." She paused, looking out at the crowd, teens, families, activists, and police officers who had pledged to change. "This center isn't just for those who have faced injustice. It's for everyone who wants to build a better world." Queen's words moved the crowd deeply. Applause erupted like thunder, and many couldn't hold back their tears. The Queen Carter Community Center wasn't just a place for legal aid and counseling. It also offered education, career guidance, and life skills training for youth. Joe, now a full-time staff member, organized workshops to share his story. "I was part of the problem," he said during one session. "But if I can change, so can you. We don't have to be defined by our mistakes." Thanks to relentless advocacy from Rosemary and Joe, police officers attended transparency and accountability training at the center. An independent oversight system was also established to ensure past mistakes wouldn't be repeated. The center quickly became a symbol of unity and hope. Families who had suffered found solace and support, while young people discovered renewed faith in the future. Queen, now a youth ambassador, often participated in major events at the center. One day, she led a group of students on a tour, showing them the art that had come to represent the center's mission. As she spoke, her voice reflected the same courage that had inspired so many before her. And in that moment, it was clear. Change had begun, and hope was taking root.
Interest.
The Queen Carter Community Center had become a beacon of hope and change, offering not only legal aid and counseling, but also educational and sports programs. "This is a place where everyone is welcome," Queen said, her smile lighting up her face. At another ceremony, Rosemary and Queen stood before a large mural painted by the teens in the center's art program. It depicted a bridge connecting two riverbanks, with the words, "Justice is the bridge to the future," boldly displayed. Rosemary looked at Queen, pride swelling in her chest. "You helped us achieve this, Queen. You're the symbol of everything we hope for. Queen's voice was soft but firm as she replied, "It wasn't just me, Aunt Rosemary. This was everyone's effort. And I know we'll keep doing even more." Before the ceremony ended, Rosemary gave one final speech. Her eyes bright with conviction, she addressed the crowd. "This center is proof that change doesn't come from one person, but from the power of unity. Our journey is far from over, but today we know we're on the right path. We do this not just for ourselves, but for the next generation, like Queen and all the children who deserve to grow up in a fairer world." The applause was thunderous and unrelenting. People looked at one another, deeply moved. They weren't just witnessing a special day, but the start of a new chapter. A chapter of hope, justice, and renewal. In the back of the room, Joe stood quietly, watching Rosemary and Queen holding hands on stage. For the first time in years, he felt a profound sense of peace, a sense that he had contributed to something far greater than himself. From that day forward, the legacy of Rosemary, Queen, and everyone who had fought would live on, inspiring generations to come. The story of Rosemary Carter, Queen, and Joe Walker is not just a journey of fighting against injustice, but also a profound lesson in the power of unity, courage, and the ability to change. What are your thoughts on this inspiring journey? If you were in Joe or Rosemary's situation, what would you do to challenge an unjust system? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. Thank you for being with us, and see you in the next video.